Hi, I'm Owen from Rask Australia. Thanks for tuning in to the Rask Network.
Before we get into today's show, there are a few things we have to go over.
Firstly, what you're about to hear and see is limited to general information only. It's not personal financial advice like you get from a financial planner. Also, it's important to remember that past performance is not indicative of future performance. That means that anything that's happened in the past, or we say today, is not necessarily going to reflect what happens in the future. Lastly, please consider that any of the guests or myself are featuring on this program may have a financial interest in some of the products or shares mentioned. That's enough from me. I hope you enjoyed today's program.
Chris, welcome to this episode of the Australian Finance Podcast.
Looking forward to it, Owen. Good to chat.
Good to chat, mate. Normally we chat on the Australian Property Podcast, which is the show that you co-host every week with Pete Wargent, the Honourable Pete Wargent, and Amy Lunardi over there. But we have received so many property questions that I think you and I are just going to have to do this every month for everyone over here on the Australian Finance Podcast. Mate, really quickly, people have probably heard you before. They probably heard the Blusk name. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So I run a mortgage broking business called Blusk. It was Wealthful before we rebranded this year. We've been going about 9-10 years, the business now, but I was a financial advisor before that. So I started as an advisor back in 2007, and we sold our financial advice business back in 2020. So we're mortgage brokers. We came from a financial advice background, and a lot of people in the business have. So Ben, my business partner, came from a paraplanning advice background. And there's a big team of us now. There's 16 of us, all doing sort of different roles within the business. So we're brokers that really try to be trusted advisors for our clients and help them think through strategically, what are they doing from a property point of view. And when you started the episode off, a lot of property questions, it makes sense, right? You've got a lot of your audience probably in the more younger demographic. I know you've got a huge following in lots of different, demographics, but property is just the biggest asset in Australians' portfolio, and it's such a big lumpy investment decision that everything kind of revolves around that. It's sort of what I sort of figured out when I stopped working with older clients and started working with younger people is, I'm saving for my first home, or I'm thinking about doing an upgrade, or I want to do a renovation, or I've only got limited cash, so I want to leverage it, and then property makes sense. And so a lot of, and then there's the property obsession we've got in Australia. So I'm looking forward to doing these episodes each month. Yeah,
we originally met years ago. I don't know how long ago. It was a long time ago. I think maybe it was even when you're still doing a bit of financial advice. But Chris, for those that don't know, Chris is my mortgage broker, and I did really luck out with this because Chris was recently voted the #1 mortgage broker in Australia by The Advisor. So awesome, mate. Awesome. I definitely lucked out, and I think we're all lucking out a bit today to get you on the show. And since then, for full disclosure, we've actually formed a partnership with Blusk because I've worked with Chris for my own journey. I figured everyone else might want to as well. So there's a link in the show notes that will take you to a form that you can fill in and get sent direct to Chris and his team. So you can work with the team. And there's a few great questions that are come today along the lines of like, when should you get in touch with a mortgage broker? So maybe a lot of that will be borne out in the questions. If you do send your question in, the best place to do it is there's a link in the podcast player. So if you're listening on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts, just click the link that says ask a question. And then it will take you to an online form and select the Australian Finance Podcast for this channel. As I said, Chris and Pete and Amy are also available on the Australian Property Podcast. Chris also has the Elephant in the Room podcast. So plenty of ways to get in contact, but a lot of these questions were sent in via social media, Chris. Just a quick note for disclaimer reasons. If we do talk about the question that you've sent in, we don't know your full circumstances. So please make sure you reach out to an advisor or get in contact with your mortgage broker or tax accountant, as they are the ones who can take into account your personal circumstances. A free call or a catch up with Chris and his team is really easy to do, and they'll give you kind of the nuts and bolts advice straight out of the gate, which is great. So the first question comes from Rob, and this is a really, really important one where I see so many first home buyers in particular go wrong, Chris. Rob says, what is a good asset, in quotes, in relation to property? This is the most common clause you warn about, but I'd love to know how you determine what this is. Like, what is a good asset, Chris?
Look, I could do 30 minutes on this and a full deep dive. I could probably do 3 hours on this or 3 days. And so to do this in 3 or 4 minutes is really hard, right? And I think to start this off, though, I think what you really need to think through is that not all properties equal. There's 11 million dwellings in Australia, right? 11 million different properties, and they're all growing at different rates. Suburbs don't grow at the same rate. It's not like and you don't buy the Australian property market index like an ETF. You buy one property on one street, you buy one of those 11 million dwellings, and maybe you buy 2 or 3 of them, but you don't really ever get true diversification. And so what you just really understand is that all properties grow at different rates, and they might grow at similar rates within a suburb, but even still, properties on different sides of the street will grow at different rates because one gets better aspect than the other, for example. So what you really want to do is think about property from a 101 economics. Who really wants to own the property, not rent it. Rent doesn't drive its price, because rent's just someone who's, who wants to own the property, who's willing to take out a mortgage, who's willing to put their life savings in to own it, right? And, what are they earning, and, are they on one income or 2 incomes? Are they on smaller incomes or higher incomes, etc.? So you really want to delve into a property's qualities based on, the incomes basically, and the potentially people moving there in the future, what their incomes are as well. So who really wants to own it? What's the demand? Is it really strong demand or is it really weak demand? So if you think about a single person on one income and maybe it's a lower income, well, that property may not be a great asset because that person won't have much cash generally and they won't have much borrowing capacity. But if that property is desirable for a couple, that's great. So now you've got 2 incomes. If it's a higher income couple, that's really desirable because they've potentially got bigger borrowing capacity and bigger other assets. The other thing is it could be desirable to a downsizer, someone selling out of a house. If they really want your place, well, that's another big strong demand pool. So think about it from a demand point of view, not whether you like it, but who else would really want that property and what's their personal situation and their incomes and things like that. And you really want strong demand. The second thing is, though, that even if a property's got strong demand, is there a limit on supply? And so if you're buying a property, you need to think through, are they going to build more of what I'm going to buy? And if so, then you've got to be really careful because in the future, someone may say, well, I like your property, but I could also buy something brand new that's exactly the same. And I'd have to buy something 3 years old for the same price. And so, new house and land packages, new apartments, new townhouses, they may have good demand. However, they have a supply issue. So the dream property you want to get is really strong demand, growing demand, as demographics and more population move to a location, they really want your type of property. And then there's also limited supply. Now, if it ticks those 2 boxes, then you can go level 2 and say, right, okay, is it got a good street? That if it's on a better street than a poor street, you're going to have stronger demand, right? If it's got busier roads, is it got good light? Has it got good privacy? Has it got good floor plan? Has it got, really nice streetscape? Is there parking? So there's lots of other elements, but if you go to that fundamental, the demand and the supply, that rules out a lot of properties. And then you start doing the deal breakers on top, which are those other sort of property specific issues.
Yeah, we talked a lot about, that was great, by the way. We talk a lot about like property briefs and the must-haves and those types of things on the property podcast. But the way you put it there is very clear to people. So you're looking for those scarce assets, I think you've called them before. Pardon me, those things that you might not be able to just get in every suburb or every location. You're looking for the properties that you're going to sell to someone who has budget to buy it from you at a higher amount.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, though, Chris, do say things like, well, I can't afford that as my first home or something like that. And that's where this second question comes from. It comes from Samuel on Instagram, who says, do I buy a small or cheap property now or wait and risk being priced out as prices go up? So they're basically saying, well, I love that kind of idea that you talk about a lot, but what happens if I can't afford it right now? What can I do?
So I guess, Samuel, it's a good question, right? So we often see this, in particular, people who are sometimes on the, the middle to higher incomes, right? And they've lived a good life and then they haven't saved because they've been spending everything they earn. And finally they go, let's start doing something for our future. I've been working for 10 years. I've got nothing in the bank. What have I got left to show for it? And so they say 50,000, let's just call it. And they go, right, let's just get something, right? So the question is, Samuel, is, how long is the gap between now and then potentially when you can afford it? And what's stopping you? Is it means that you've just got to get a wage increase? Is it mean you've got to get your savings up? Or is it really just not possible anyway, because those things aren't going to change much? Your salary is almost capped. Your savings are growing slowly. Then you might just say, well, based on my budget, that's all I've really got. It's unlikely to increase dramatically because my income's not going up and my savings is not going to allow me to potentially borrow more. So maybe it's just getting the best asset I can today. However, what we do often see is people who potentially, if they just got that next promotion or they just increased their savings another, 30,000, then that created a lot more options. And so buying something today, what they can afford today versus what they could afford in 6 or 12 months down the line, they would have been better off to wait. And that's a temptation when sometimes people just want to get into the market because there's a bit of FOMO and prices are going up in the media, and they rush that decision. They get something, and then 6 to 12 months' time, their situations, they've still saved. Then they go and buy another cheaper property. And all of a sudden, they're accruing all these what we call subpar assets because they've just bought what they could afford at a certain point in time. That's why I find it hard when you constantly see it over the social channels. When's the best place to buy a property? 20 years ago. When's the next best price to do it today? Well, it's very simplistic. That's not always true. Potentially it's better to buy it in 6 months' time when you've got more savings or more capacity. And a lot of investments brokers do this as well. Is like you're missing out if you're not in the market today. So obviously, and that's when Owen did the disclaimer there. There's two reasons. One, there's a legal reason he did that, but secondly, it's really true. Someone's situations, everyone's on, got different backgrounds. They've got different plans for the future, different assets, different savings, different family, and everyone's doing different things, especially in the property market. And so, having one way, and so potentially we're always constantly figuring and tweaking and go, for you, it's potentially to do this because this is what you're telling me. And it's not like a one size fits all approach. Maybe sometimes other products can be like super insurance and things like that can be a little bit more, you can follow a philosophy and just go get the product. But I feel like with property, especially, it's everyone's doing different things, especially.
And because people can, I don't want to scare anyone that hasn't bought a property yet, but people can blow themselves up on this stuff because they don't really factor in like the long-term implications of what they're doing. So I see a lot of people, Chris, I know you work like a lot with like young families, first home buyers, but also upgraders and the like. I see a lot of people make really bad sacrifices on this really important asset in their life. And it can either be a springboard or it can be an anchor for some people. So getting the right advice is so important. And that actually brings me to some other questions, which we might jump down to and then come back to the other one in just a second. So this is from Newbie Buyer. That's what they call themselves. I have talked to a mortgage broker for my first property purchase. The broker said I can borrow the amount that I want to borrow. So I should talk to him once again once I find a property I like, and I do not need pre-approval. Is this normal? Chris, I might just add a thing in here to say a lot of my experience with mortgage brokers has been cookie cutter, which is why we obviously work together, because it's not cookie cutter. But is it normal? Does this situation sound normal? Like come back in the future kind of thing?
It can be. And depending on how many questions that person's asked you, and depending on how truthfully you've answered those questions and how well they know policy, unless, so we don't take that approach. We don't take a mud on the wall approach. Like, someone calls me up and says, oh, this is what my income, and I just roughly roll off what they can borrow. There's so much more that goes into a mortgage application that I need to know. I need to know your credit file. I need to know other assets. I need to know your job and, how your pay's structured. And a lot of people get it wrong. They think they're getting more than they're earning, or, they didn't know they've got some issue with their credit file. We've got one at the moment, just didn't know there was a massive issue on their credit file. And so, I would always say, if the broker's gone through and got all your documents and it's giving you a proper strategy, and they really know what they're doing, like we've got 100% approval rate. I can't remember the last time we had a declined loan. The reason is we go through your situation with a fine-tooth comb and know exactly what's a bank. And if we're worried about a bank approving it, we actually speak to the bank first and go, will you give us an exception for this situation because of X, Y, Z? And so if a broker's done that, that to me, in our situation, we know that's as good as a pre-approval because we know it's going to get approved. However, for peace of mind, we'd also recommend you just go get that pre-approval. Because sometimes, and it's happening a bit at the moment, when rates went up, your borrowing capacity falls a little bit. So with a pre-approval, it locks in that borrowing capacity for 3 months. Small things like that. So I would just, when you're buying, sometimes you need to move fast. And so, just having that real peace of mind that I've got one bank willing to lend me this amount. They may or may not be the absolute optimal, but they're a good option. Then when you purchase, if it's a short settlement, you may not have the luxury, like I'm talking a 3 or 4 week settlement, which sometimes happens. You may not have the luxury to shop the market, but because you've got a pre-approval, you can settle. And so, that there's a few reasons why you'd still want to be pre-approved. You don't have to, right? But it just makes common sense. There's no cost. If you just do one of them every few months, it's not going to affect your credit rating, especially if it's approved. And so it's just, good.
Does that also, in your mind, Chris, because when people make offers in a hot market or there's a good asset like you were talking about before, like in a suburb, in a house, in a street, there's a house that people really want to live in and there are multiple offers. In your mind, does it give the buyer some confidence and also the person that's selling the house because you can say you've got pre-approval?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of agents, if they don't think you're pre-approved, they're not going to think you're serious. It's not, you don't have to tell them that anyway. You could actually say I'm pre-approved and you're not, etc. But ultimately, that's one of the things you'd probably be saying, is that we're fully pre-approved. We've made offers on places before. We're ready to go. Sometimes people try to play it too cool with agents, right? And, I'm not going to tell you anything. Well, hang on a second. How do they know to put you on the hit list, the hot list? That's what you're going to find out about properties. And so absolutely. I think with offers, to get great assets, you can either offer more money than everyone else or you offer better terms, right? And or a bit of both. You offer, a real close amount of money to what everyone else is willing to pay, but you offer the best terms. And terms could be the settlement period. It could be unconditional offer, which is a big one. And so if you're pre-approved, you've got a good broker, you have the confidence, and that generally speaking, great assets sell under unconditional offers because someone's using that as a negotiation tool. They're saying, I know there's competition on it. I know there's 4 people wanting it. Then they all basically have to offer unconditional offers, and then it comes down to price and usually the time frame on the settlement. So, and you as a buyer having a confidence to make an unconditional offer, you really want to have a pre-approval just to know that you got that certainty that nothing's going to go wrong.
For sure.
And it doesn't. There's no cost, and there's no doesn't. Yeah. So definitely get yourself pre-approved.
Yeah, and this is where a good broker can educate you, as well as a solicitor or your conveyancer can educate you on how to make a confident bid and knowing that you protect yourself as well. Whereas if you just call up your mortgage broker and they say, yep, no worries, you don't really get the confidence that you're dealing with a professional. So
I'll just have one final point because it is a big one. So with pre-approvals, there's 2 types. There's humanly assessed, where a bank basically goes through and ticks off all the things. They've checked it all, right? They've checked your payslips.
Proper assessment.
A computer assessment, which a lot of banks are moving towards, right? Because it's very low cost for them versus someone sitting at a desk going through payslips, expensive. A lot of pre-approvals don't go ahead. So banks are like, well, let's just give someone a computer assessed pre-approval, but it's not humanly assessed. You've got to be careful there because if that data is not put in correctly or they've missed something, and that affects that pre-approval is invalid. And a lot of online lenders, for example, potentially use these as well. So just be really careful. What you want is a humanly assessed pre-approval. And that means the conditions on them are really just subject to evaluation usually. And then they're just going to get your latest pay slips when you purchase to make sure you're still working. But they're not going to ask for all your documents and do all this check on your file because they've already done all that.
Yeah.
They're just going to check you're still working, check you're buying your good property, do evaluation on it, which 99.9% of the time is fine. And then you're going to get formal approval.
Sweet. Okay, so I've got a question here from Marty, which is a bit different. So might just skip through a little bit of it, but Marty says currently saving for a deposit and have a meeting with the mortgage broker booked for January. So I think that's upcoming January. They invest a bit of their money into an ETF and they save the majority. So they're doing a bit of both, which is what we advocate for, Chris, because if people feel like they're not getting ahead because they are saving, well, at least they can learn the craft of investing and get regimented savings down. And the question is basically, should I stop investing and just save all the money for the home, or should I keep investing? What would be more appealing to a bank?
Look, we'd love to say that the banks look at things, case by case and, put their own personal opinion on things and say, look, Marty looks like a better customer because he did X, Y, Z. They look at things a bit more black and white. Whether you got your money in cash or shares, the bank probably doesn't really care. They just want to care that you've got enough money to settle the property. It's a similar like a credit file, like taking out a credit card, paying it off on time. Like you really either got good credit in the bank size or bad credit, right? So it's more a case of just not doing any mistakes with credit and a bank will lend to you. So probably doesn't matter too much, Marty. And I think it's just, all I would say there is, equities are a little bit more volatile over short periods. And so as you get closer and closer to your property decision, you've just got to be aware that when you're buying into shares that you potentially open yourself up to short-term volatility a bit more. And the additional potential return on that might outweigh the risk of a potential, market correction in a short time frame. But I absolutely agree. I think when you're especially starting out with investing, it's all about building great habits, right? And
for sure,
and understanding and getting comfortable with volatility. And so when you are buying, even if it says here only a third of their savings going into that, I think it's great because you're seeing markets go up, you're seeing markets, go down, and you're getting comfortable with volatility. It's one of the biggest things you need to when you're investing.
Yeah, for sure it is. And Marty, this is the thing: if you've got a good mortgage broker working for you, which it seems like you might in this instance, or they're prepared to, you can call them now and ask this question because they would probably, I could be wrong, Chris, tell me if I'm wrong here, they might ask, well, how much do you have in savings already? And when do you plan to buy? Because I feel like they might be able to give you some insight into, well, how far do you have to go to save? Do you need to continue saving, or should you be investing? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. There's lots of misunderstanding of what you need for a deposit. Sometimes people think they need less than they actually do, and sometimes people think they need a lot more. And so, and government schemes are always changing. They flipped with stamp duty in the last few months. They had the 5% deposit home loans. They all changed in July as well, and things like that. So absolutely, what they said to you 6 months ago might be actually not true anymore. There might actually be some more options there. So stay close, especially if you're close to your goal, because sometimes saving for an extra 6 months may mean, a good, like a whole different period. The property market basically moves in two cycles, right? You've got your autumn sort of pre-winter period and your spring period, and a lot can change in those periods. Markets can move quite fast, and so 6 months can be quite costly to wait if you didn't need to because you thought you had to because you had to save some money. Then you go, actually, no, we could have bought 6 months ago, which would have saved us 3 or 4% in our purchase.
So I know a lot of people that come through us and work with Blusk. They're not maybe ready to borrow right now, or maybe their borrowing capacity isn't there right now. But this is just a question from me generally. In your mind, if you're dealing with a first home buyer or even an upgrade, like someone who already has a home or an investor, whatever, when should they get in contact with you?
Look, we've got resources to talk to that person now, right, and give them the clarity on the savings goal and how much they need for a deposit and any issues that and sometimes it's just asking a few questions that you just want to be clear on things, and then that could be a 7-minute conversation or it could be a 20-minute chat. We'll be able to explain it. It's no point going through a pre-approval now because you're not actually going to get pre-approved. However, if your savings was XYZ, then potentially you could do it. Or they might say, is there any other options? We say, well, is there a guarantor a good option for you? And you might have thought, well, I haven't thought about that before. And then maybe you start research that and then you speak to your parents and etc. So I don't think it's too, sometimes also people are considering like that first question. I can't remember what was from Ron, but Samuel, I think, do I just buy something now because I've got some savings? I think that's also a good time to, a good broker, I think, would, educate you and say, actually, your borrowing capacity is really strong. You're on great incomes, but you just haven't got much savings. So do you really want to waste some of that borrowing capacity on that property?
Good point.
It's probably never too early because if it just gives you enough clarity to give you a savings goal and an idea of what you need to do today. And then just keep track of, anything that comes out from, and if you're listening to podcasts, you are going to be more across these things.
Absolutely.
Anything changes in the government schemes because, they feel like they're changing every 6 to 12 months like governments.
That's why if you have, you can either research this or yourself. A lot of the ATO website has some information on different schemes, but also industry websites, or just speak to a broker that operates in your state. Chris obviously works across the country, but speak to a broker that operates across your state. There was one, I've got basically two questions to go, Chris. One was from Kat, and this was one that's like applies to anyone. But Kat says, I'm a first home buyer. My broker is asking if I preferred fixed or variable interest rate. Given the rising interest rates and or possible decline in a few years' time, what are the pros and cons of this type of loan?
Yeah, so
big question.
The broker asking questions to you is hard, right? There, it's something that, it's definitely brokers do it, right? Like we want to give you what you want. But part of a great broker is actually being more of a trusted advisor, right? Not a validator or a facilitator. It's more someone saying, look, this is what we think you should potentially do, educating on the pros and cons, but ultimately having a bit of a preference to educate you the benefits and the risks. And so, look, so that's what just generally when how do you want to structure the loan? Like interest only, print off or versus principal and interest. They might ask you that question, but it's also then educating you on the pros and cons and, and should I pay LMI or not? So, because they're coming from a place of knowledge, right? They're seeing this, they know. And so I would say a good broker would guide you on this question and would basically explain to you where current fixed rates are, how they compare to the current variable rate. Generally speaking, you will win on going variable over fixed, but there's times when fixed makes a lot of sense. So if, for example, you couldn't sustain any interest rate rises because you were so tight and you needed to really protect yourself and you really wanted that clarity. But I'd also argue in this situation, you've got to be a bit careful because if rates are at the top of the cycle and rate cuts come and rate cuts are much faster than you expect, are you going to wish you went on variable? So, and you don't have to go all variable or fixed.
Yeah.
So you can sort of mix it and go, and you should never fix all your loans, to be honest, because generally you can't offset fixed loans. There's some banks you can, but generally you can't. So yeah, don't go, if you are going to fix, maybe don't fix it all, fix a portion. But even right now, it's hard to argue fixing. Sometimes we fix for 1 or 2 years if it's a really good rate. But very, very little. Whereas in 2020, 2021, we were fixing 80, 90% of our clients and 80, 90% of their loans. Because, you're getting fixed rates in the 2s versus, and if rates went up, they'd be super winning. So,
I remember you told me us to fix a portion of our loan, but keep a portion of it variable so we could use those offset accounts, which we've been using. And I, for some reason, before I bought a property, even as a finance person myself, because I always just thought that it had to be fixed or variable. I didn't know you could do a combination of the two, but it makes so much sense to do that. Okay, so the last two questions, I'm going to try and bundle them into one, Chris, because they're they're along a similar line. So Danielle asked a question on Instagram, and Ivy Gray asked a question as well. Danielle's question was, how do I navigate a subject to sale purchase? So they're buying a property where it's subject to another sale, looking to upgrade my house, but will need to sell my house to do it. Right, so they're selling their house. Okay, okay. And then the second one from Ivy Gray was buying first versus selling first when upgrading your home in the middle of a rental crisis. What are the finance options, pros, cons, and risks of the different ways to do it? So these are more for people that have homes and they're looking to purchase another home, but they need to sell, obviously.
Yep. So we do lots of work with people in this situation, right? Maybe they've got an apartment and they want to upgrade to a house, or maybe they're in one house and they want to upgrade to a bigger house. And so there's it's a really tricky one, and you can really get it wrong, unfortunately. And because what you're doing is you're doing two transactions here. You're selling and you're buying, and if you sell really well, that hasn't solved your problem. You still need to buy really well, and so. One of the temptation things, people like certainty, right? And so they think this logically, and they say, well, I'm going to sell first. And I'm only going to sell for a certain price. And if I don't get that price, I'm not going to sell. But what they're focusing too much on their current property and its sale price. They're not thinking through, well, obviously they're going to have to sell it anyway because they do need to do an upgrade. And so rather than potentially, they too much focus on trying to get a certain price to sell, but that may, if they keep focusing on that, then they're not focusing on their next attraction, is buying, which could be running on them. That price of that property could be going up. So this is probably the more important one to focus on. One of the dangers of selling first is if you sell, you got the money in the bank, you're super happy. Then you got to potentially rent something. You could sell on a longer settlement, and so maybe like 90 or 120 days and try to buy. But no matter if you try to sell on a long settlement or you sell on a short settlement, you have to rent. It's really stressful then because, like you say, rental crisis or not rental crisis, you've got to be in the rental market. And so you've got to sign a lease, you've got to do all your move, your furniture. Naturally, when people are out of the market, they get a bit edgy, they get a bit nervous, like especially if prices start to move, and they can move really fast. And so what we see in this situation when someone sells first is their brain and emotions start to take over. This happens to me. It happens even people who know what they're doing, who buy property every day. It's so emotional when you got partners and kids and, even work and the market's moving on you. You're not thinking rationally. And so because you're out of the market and you're renting, and maybe your lease is running out, or maybe you really want to buy pre-Christmas, what ends up happening is you're just looking at whatever's on the market right now. And great assets don't come on all the time. And what ends up happening is people get burnout and they get like buyer fatigue. And then they get a bit stressed because they're in the rental accommodation, and then the market starts moving, and then they rush the purchase because they're renting and they just want to get back in the market. And so what we see is the big risk of selling first is you could sell at the price in January when you sell, but then you might take 6 months to buy, and the market could move a bit in that 6 months, and you're out of the market, so all you got your money is return on cash. And secondly, you rush the purchase. So you just basically go from one frying pan to the other. Yeah. So the reason why someone would do that first is if they've got an asset that's not a great asset at the moment, because that could take a long time to sell, or it's really variable what they're going to sell it for. And so sometimes it's best just to get rid of it to know exactly but often when it's not, if it's a medium to quality asset, I'd really encourage someone to consider, can they look to buy before selling? And really understand the risk. So what you would do is you would try to, really get a good clarity on what you can sell for, speak to multiple agents, get your property ready for sale. It's like, you paint it, you tidy things up because you do need to sell it fast. The more presentable it is, the easier it is to sell. Get real good clarity on what you're going to sell it for. Let's just call it $500,000. And get pre-approved on what you could purchase if you sell. So some banks will do this for you, assuming you've sold. And you're out there looking to the next place, and you be really patient and you wait for that really good asset. And then when you finally find it, could take you many months, but you're not out of the market. You got somewhere to live. You try to buy it on a 3 or a 4 month settlement. And if you catch that property very early in the campaign, it only just listed, or it's going to come on the market in the next week, an agent told you about it, a lot of sellers will be open to that, because they were already thinking it's going to take 3 months to sell this anyway. And so in this situation, you buy on a 3-4 month settlement, but when you're going to sign the contract, you speak to the agent on your current property, who you most likely will sell through, and say, what's actually sold this week that's similar to mine? Or you try to go to an auction on a similar property to yours. You should always do that. So you buy on a longer settlement, and then as soon as you purchase, your property goes on the market. Yeah. You've picked your stylist, exactly who agent you're going to do. They do the photos and they list it. And then you've got 4 months to sort of not just sell it, but also get it settled. And so I would really encourage a lot of people to consider that. Look, what you need to do in that situation is make sure, even if you get a bad day price on the sale, you can still settle on the new property. See, it's not everyone can do this. But it's really saves. What we see the outcome is when you sell first often is you end up jumping too fast into the wrong property because your basically emotions take over and you just want to get something because the market's moving on you and you get freaked out.
It sounds like so much of that, Chris. It sounds like so much of that depends, and it's going to sound so simple for me to put it this way, but it depends on the quality of the house you have now and the quality of the house you're buying. It seems like so much of it depends on those two things because that impacts the timing. But the other thing that you said, what you do have in your control is being ready, like being prepared for what comes next.
So we've got a client literally doing it at the moment. Multiple client chats with her this week. I love working with her. And they've got an apartment in the east and they're trying to buy to a house in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. And, she thinks she might sell the big numbers for some people, but I saw her apartment at 1.5 to 1.8. It's quite a big range.
Wow.
And but they know what they've got this other place. They know what they can purchase it for, and they think that's a really good deal. And it is, to be honest, it needs a good reno, and they're not as hot as other properties right now. So, if she can lock in a really good buy price, she's taking a gamble on what she's going to sell this apartment for. But if she can still afford it, even if it doesn't get the greatest price and it sells for 1.5, well, she's still won on the next property, which is a great asset. And what we've seen in this situation, a lot of people, they still win on the sale. It still gets 1.7, it gets 1.8. And yeah, they could have, and they didn't have to sell first and be out of the market. And they can often win on both transactions by buying really well, presenting their property really well, hitting the market, getting the right agent, styling it, and then doing a really good campaign. They get a great sale price, which they're always going to do anyway. But yeah, they didn't have that certainty when they purchased. So it's a bit of a leap of faith. But if you do all those steps up front, you can give yourself the best chance of pulling it off, where you bought well and you've sold well. And that transaction hasn't really killed you. But if it goes wrong, if you buy the wrong property, or you overpay on the purchase because you're desperate, or you don't get the right sale price, or you don't buy upgrade at all because you're just so nervous, then there's an opportunity cost that's really going to kill you.
Yeah, for sure. Clearly, that's a higher stakes game for a lot of folks. So
it is.
Really be careful, really have your strategy thought out, and speak to multiple professionals that you need to speak to. And I think Chris's advice there was quite salient as well, which is that if you do get an assessment from agents, real estate agents, just remember real estate agents, who they work for and what their incentives are. Get multiple opinions on the value of your existing home before you go into this. So just to recap, we've had some great questions come through from Rob, who asked about what is a good quality asset. That's a really important thing to remember for long-term wealth creation, because so many people will create wealth from their property, not just their share investments and all those types of things. Waiting to buy a better property or buying cheap now, speak to your broker. Locked in or variable rates. Chris gave some good advice on that. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. And all in all, when you're doing an upgrade or you're doing something like this, you're transitioning properties, be mindful, prepare yourself, and also try to control your emotions as best you can. You probably won't be able to do it completely. Chris, we've obviously got a way for people to get in contact with you. There's a link in the show notes that goes to a form that people can fill in and book straight into your team's calendars. Just to cover off, you primarily deal with clients from Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, along the East Coast, but do you have clients anywhere else as well?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's well into the hundreds, maybe up to 200 now. People have come through this partnership. So, and they're all over, all different parts of their life and backgrounds and locations. And the good thing about mortgage broking for us, to be honest, is we can help people all over the place, rather than a real estate agent or a buyer's agent. It's really focused on, and even conveyancers, and it's very hard for them to work in different states. But mortgage brokers, the bank and the lending side, we can work with clients anywhere in Australia, or where they're buying could be anywhere in Australia. So yeah. And to be honest, what you really want is a real trusted advisor. Yes, you could go and walk into an office and see a broker, but it's all basically digital now anyway, the whole application process. And so, and you can do video calls, and you can still speak to people. So yeah, that local broker, if they're potentially going for local knowledge with that broker of the local market, could be a bit careful with that as well, because they've got to have their own personal opinions on that, but they're not buyer's agents. And so, generally speaking, you want to be getting a lot of that local knowledge off those buyer's agents anyway, to be honest. So we've gone and built partnerships with over 40 or 50 different buyer's agents across the country. So, that gives us local knowledge across all those markets, because we can work with those local buyer's agents.
Great.
And so, yeah,
that's great. Well, we're going to be back on next month, because we do the Q&As for investing, and we do the Q&As with financial planners, but we haven't done property Q&A yet. And I think just based on the sheer number of responses we got from a few short social posts, we're going to be back again next month. So Chris from Blusk is going to be back next month. So send your questions in. There is a link in the show notes. And if you just absolutely love property and you want to learn more, just like Chris and I, jump over to the Australian Property Podcast. We've done a few cross posts in time, but the Australian Property Podcast now has over 23,000 listeners, which is just amazing considering it was only started a couple of months ago. Chris here, Pete Wargent, Amy Lunardi, and I occasionally do a cameo on there, and I love it. So get across there, have a look. Chris, mate, always a pleasure. So thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much, Owen.